I am a New Yorker. I was born in New York. I'm now 92 years old, and I've spent the bulk of my life in New York City. I am virtually a Depression child. I grew up in the 30s. My father, he worked 7 days a week, and my mother was a housekeeper, and that was the story. And I had two sisters who grew up and went to public institutions, as did I. I went on to high school in the Bronx, at the Bronx High School of Science. So when I went to college, I more or less decided that I would go into engineering and not do liberal arts because I came from the Bronx High School of Science. I liked it, and I liked the theory of it, but I didn't like doing it. And what do I mean by the theory of it? I liked the feeling of being an engineer, because what we learned was how to do things, how to fix things. At engineering school, I discovered that the one area which might appeal to me was industrial engineering, where you learned about corporations, how they work, and what industrial engineers did at that time. But my grounding in industrial engineering was so fundamental that it never left me, because you learned what a corporation really was. Simple, really. Money goes in, you use it to make things, you sell it to people, and that's good. It's the nexus between you and a piece of goods or a service. That's all. It's a conduit. In engineering school, I had a professor who taught law for engineers. He was the assistant dean of the law school. And it was the only course at engineering school where I got an A. I went to see the dean, Dean Gifford at the law school, who had been I say, Dean Gifford, this isn't for me. I got to do something. What do you think? So he and I talked a while. He said, well, why don't you try law school? I said, law school? I never even thought of that. He said, well, our experience is that every misfit in the world winds up in law school. So I said, well, that's interesting. I'm a misfit. I don't know what I'm going to do. He said, try it. You might like it. I went to Columbia Law School, of which there was nothing better. I did not get on law review, which was a great disappointment to me, because I figured if you didn't make law review, you wouldn't be anything, and you got out of law school. But I was lucky enough to see Dean Gifford, and he said, don't get discouraged. You're an engineer, you don't know how to read, so your first year was learning how to read. Now you learn how to read, you'll get better. In the meantime, I'll get you a job with one of the professors, because you're smart enough to do that. And he got me a job as a student assistant to Milton Handler, who was teaching antitrust. So I didn't know much about antitrust, but when I got to know it a little bit, it seemed to be a perfect fit. You know, here are corporations. I'm an engineer. I would like to see how they work. And antitrust is a way to make sure they don't go crazy. And in those days, it was just beginning. Trade regulation, it was called. And so I helped Professor Handler write his book. I learned a lot. And he beat me up mentally until I learned how to write, how to read, what a case was. And by the time I got out of law school, I was way up in the top 10 of my class and a Stone Scholar, and I had no trouble getting a job. I couldn't get a job in New York with any of the firms that were practicing antitrust law, because they were then the white shoe law firms. And white shoe law firms did not hire Jews. But when I got out of law school and couldn't get a job with one of the white shoe law firms, Professor Handler suggested I go to work for the Department of Justice. And in those days, getting into the antitrust division of the Department of Justice was a thing. I mean, I couldn't have been prouder. I loved it. I loved going to court with the flag behind me. Directly out of the Department of Justice, I went with Weil Gotshal. While they put me to work on everything. Matrimonials, tax returns, accident cases, whatever we had, I was involved in, which was also great, because I learned to be a lawyer, and I got my hands dirty. Over time, I got into the big companies, not directly because of antitrust, because I was good at something else. And I was good at consumer credit. I was hired by JCPenney and eventually by GE Credit to do some financial credit work, because they were all in the consumer finance business. That's where I learned consumer credit, and I got somewhat of an expert in the field, and I helped draw the Truth in Lending Bill, and helped federally and statewide to create these laws, got known as such, and then got hired to figure out how do you live with them, which is what I was doing with the retailers. That's why I got hired originally by GM and originally by GE and Penny, all three of them. And I got to know them, and I got to know the general counsel, and I got to know them pretty well. And they got to trust me. General counsel for J.C. Penney wanted a lawyer who was his lawyer and not the chairman's lawyer. He wanted somebody who was not related to people on the board of directors. And he said to me one day, he said, I would like to hire you to do some other things for J.C. Penney, provided you understand you report to me and not to the chairman of the board. So eventually, he introduced me to the general counsel of GE and of General Motors. And the general counsel came to me at GE with a credit problem, and the general counsel came to me at GM with a corporate problem, which was at that time they had bought things which they shouldn't have bought, like Perot's company, and like Hughes Aircraft, and so on, because the chairman had decided he wanted to branch out and do different things. And so they had the problem of being related to their subsidiaries, doing business with them, and they didn't quite know how to do it legitimately. And so he came to me, and we had to invent a way for the parent to do business with the subsidiary and not get into trouble. And we invented a thing called the Capital Stock Committee of the board. And its job was to monitor the relationship between the subs and the parent. And that got me into the boardroom. When I got into the boardroom, I became very friendly with some of the members of the board because the general counsel wanted me to know them better because we were beginning to teach them things they hadn't done before, namely participate with management. Now, the problem I saw at General Motors was obvious. The board was fast asleep. The company was going downhill at a time when it was having trouble with the Capital Stock Committee, and so I was in the boardroom often on the Capital Stock Committee. So I became their trusted advisor on things which were not antitrust, but which absolutely brought me into the boardroom to the point where I could trust them and they could trust me. Now, out of the GM experience with the Capital Stock Committee, it became clear that the company board was not deeply involved in what was happening. And while they had to monitor through the Capital Stock Committee, it was really me and the general counsel who did the job, but they came along for the ride. You're the board, and you're responsible to the shareholders to see that management is correct. And if they're not correct, fire them. Well, how are we going to do that? Well, I said, meet without the chairman. Oh, meet without the chairman? Who would do anything like that? I said, you will, if you want to accomplish something. So John Smale said, I guess you're right. And he called a meeting, and the board got a room for itself and met without the chairman. Had to break it down, had to make it a different, and they did it. And so I saw that happen. And that, to me, led me to believe that it was time for boards to change. That if this was General Motors, what was happening in the rest of the corporate world? The corporate governance principles that GM eventually put out were remarkable because they were copied by 30, 40, 50 companies across the country. And I got called in by those companies to come and help them fire their CEO. If you don't have corporate governance, If you haven't got the right to fire the CEO, if you haven't got these minimal safeguards, you're not a board, and you're not a corporation, and you're nothing. Corporate governance was all about the board. The board is center to the operation. The law gives the directors complete power. They don't seem to understand it. There is a thing called the business judgment rule, which is like the rule of reason in antitrust, but it gives the directors broad authority to do the right thing. And even if it turns out to be a loss to the company, if they studied it and thought about it and did it, they would never be successfully sued by anybody. Eventually, as corporate governance developed, I really felt I had something to say, and that you had to do more than talk to existing directors and CEOs. I wanted to talk to the next generation. So I went up to Yale and I met Professor McAvoy, and he and I were teaching together an economics course on the corporation, and we converted it to a corporate governance course. But they didn't seem to get it in their heads, and we thought it was very important for us to teach board-centric and what it meant. And that's when we began to teach what boards could do to do it the right way. I wanted then to broaden it out because I thought that what we were learning by teaching was something that board of directors might be interested in and that executives might be interested in. So we started a governance center at Yale. That didn't work because we didn't have a faculty that was interested. And so I decided at that point that I would go back to Columbia Law School, from which I graduated, and talk to the then dean and see if they were interested in a course or a center on corporate governance, and did they have a faculty? Well, it turned out that Columbia Law School had the best faculty in the world, a host of other professors, and then ultimately Eric Talley, who taught governance and loved it. And basically, it's turned out every bit as I hoped it would, because what I hoped it would be, which the professors and the faculty have helped do, is it would be a neutral place where practitioners and the academics would come together about how do you do this better. It was corporate governance had come along. It was much better than it had been, but it was a long way from being good because boards still were too passive and still were deferential to management, and now we're becoming deferential to outside forces like the stakeholders and the advisors and the opinion makers, all of whom had something to say about corporate governance. And the result was a total mix-up of advice that they were getting from pension funds, from other index funds, from the ISSs, institutional shareholders of the world, from everybody had a view. It was a big melange of stuff. And if I was sitting in the boardroom, I wouldn't know who to listen to. It became a place which was neutral, known to be neutral, which did not have a point of view, which was not selling an ideology, but where you could come to test your theories and talk. And out of that, we hope to develop a consensus of how you would make companies better, to work better by bringing together what they now had to bring together. Because the world had changed since the days that I had started. In the days that I had started, you worried about shareholders and management. But that's changed. Now you have a new capital market, different capital market. You have money available from private equity, from pension funds, from other places. So you're not completely dependent on the public markets, but you are dependent on the public markets. And we've had stakeholders become more interested. Just look at your proxy statements today calling for climate change, calling for gender change, calling for God knows what else, religious freedom, freedom of the press, etc., all of which are proxy statements now calling on the board to do something. Now, how do you put this all together? as my great author said, you have to pay attention. People have said, well, you don't pay attention. That's just social stuff. That's nonsense. It's reputational. And they have a quote, which I think is great, that the corporation may not have a soul, but it's got a brain. And the brain is saying to you, these stakeholders have something to say, and you better listen. So you have before you a picture which has got to be fixed. Your capital market has changed. Your principal responsibilities have to be modified. The Friedman free market is good. We love capitalism, but it isn't the end all and be all. It has to be sandpapered. It has to be sandpapered to bring in the whole idea of stakeholders. Well, the activist director comes in because it goes back to board-centric. Who can change this? I don't believe government can change it. They can lay down some ground rules, maybe, but only on the outskirts. But they can't change the way the corporation is going to behave with respect to all of its stakeholders. Who can really do it? Well, I'm back to my gang. It's the directors. They're the last stop on the road. I don't believe that the shareholders can do it because they have such varied opinion. They're just another stakeholder. It is all directed at my first love, the board. They have to learn how to balance. They have the freedom to sacrifice a little bit of profit in order to achieve the longer range goals. So Friedman's got to be modified, and we have to have a different kind of narrative. And the other thing that we're doing is capital markets, which is, again, a study of how the capital markets are affecting all of this. So those are two big projects which we have to keep working at. We also have what I consider to be meat and potato activities. What's the best way to run a board? What's the best way to be a developer activist director? What's the best way for CEOs to act? All of that we're doing at the same time. Going down two tracks. We're doing down my counter-narrative track, capital markets, what's the best way, what are the values, counter-narrative on the one hand, on the other hand, what's the best way to run a board? And all of that requires directors who are superhuman beings.